First, we've just got our last panelist to say a few words, and that's Rod Carr. So welcoming Rod to the room.
Kia ora everybody, ko Rod Karaho, kai whakahaere of Hei Paorangi, the Climate Change Commission. I'm just going to talk to you without slides, and I'm going to give you a very quick where we are on the Climate Change Commission's work, particularly around the energy questions which we've been talking about this evening. As many of you will know, the Commission published its draft advice for consultation at the very end of January and had submissions on that advice open until the 28th of March. As the media have reported, we've received over 15,500 submissions from New Zealanders. About 10,000 of those are what I might refer to as petition by submission, where about 20 organisations have marshalled their active stakeholder base and have provided feedback to the Commission around a number of themes or topics. And about 5,000 of these submissions are essentially substantial and in some cases very substantial reviews of the draft advice and providing additional evidence to inform the finalisation of our advice. So a bit of a process note about what happens now is the Secretariat at the Commission are busily working through all of those submissions and meta-tagging them in an appropriate way and feeding them to the analysts who will review their original draft advice in light of new evidence and the views that are being expressed in those submissions. And then the Commission Board will hold a series of workshops during May in which we will consider the advice from the team on to what extent the evidence changes our advice or would seek to amend or add to the recommendations which we had presented in draft form. We're under a statutory time limit to provide our final advice on emissions budgets out to 2035 and the emissions reduction plan to the Minister for Climate Change by the 31st of May. The Minister will then have 10 working days to table that advice in the House, and if for some reason the House, which is currently scheduled to be sitting, is not sitting, then within 20 business days of giving the advice to the Minister, the Commission is obliged to publish that advice for all New Zealand. The Government then has the obligation to determine what the emission budgets will be and what the emissions reduction plan will be for New Zealand, and they are under a statutory limit to do that by the 31st of December this year. The Government makes the decisions, the Commission has only an advisory role. However, it is worth noting that the Committee of the Parties to the Paris Agreement has a conference in Glasgow in the first 2 weeks of November, at which the New Zealand Government will be asked to explain its nationally determined contribution to potentially justify why no change is appropriate, or to provide a new nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement that would be consistent with the commitments that New Zealand has made under that agreement, which we signed up for in 2015. So it's not unreasonable to expect the Government may be under some pressure to adopt those emissions budgets and reduction plan prior to attending the Glasgow conference, which, as I said, is in the first 2 weeks of November. So this is the year in which at least public policy commitments will be made by New Zealand. Of course, all the advice and all the policy doesn't change one single kilotonne of emissions. What changes emissions is our behaviour. And what changes our behaviour is in part about markets, prices and choices that we might make as producers and consumers. And in part, it is about coercion through regulation. We live in a mixed economy, and we can expect both instruments, markets and regulation, to play their part. Just in addressing a couple of critiques of the work of the Commission so far, one relates to the data which drives some of our models, which are one of the many tools that the Commission has used to develop its draft advice. Those of you who are interested in models should jump on our website. There are massive amounts of data available that have been used to feed into these models. There are very explicit statements of the assumptions that have been made in the modelling. And we will be releasing the source code to those models once that source code has been provided to us in a form that complies with a Creative Commons license and supported documentation. That will be one of the first types of models of that nature in the world to be made available basically to the public at large. So those of you who are modeling fanatics will get your opportunity to put your hands deeply into the engine room. But also those of you who know modeling well will know that you can prove almost anything with a model by tweaking the data and the assumptions. So good luck with that. I think there's also a case that we haven't explained as well as we could or should have, what our path in our draft advice is supposed to represent. Our path is not a central plan for the New Zealand economy. Our path is a demonstration pathway which brings together a whole bunch of things that will be going on in society and the economy that would be internally consistent if you were on that path. On that path, you would, for example, observe that by 2028, around about half of the new to New Zealand imported light vehicles would be either hybrid or fully electric light vehicles. You would observe on that path that we had an emissions price or shadow price for 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent in 2030 of around about $140 a tonne. That is not a forecast for the price of an NZU in the ETS. It is simply something that comes from being on the path with all those other things going on. So just tipping a little in favour of thinking about energy. It is quite correct that the Commission, like the Interim Committee, has sought to focus our attention on the proportion of all energy produced and consumed in New Zealand that is from renewable sources, and that we need to focus on raising that proportion as we electrify ground transportation, low and medium temperature process heat, and heating the spaces we live and work in. And we think that by 2050, we might be in the low 90% of all energy used in New Zealand coming from renewable sources, compared to around 40% today. That is a massive transformation of energy production and use in this economy over the next 30 years. But we think that targeting electricity from renewable sources is an appropriate subset of the more important superset of renewable energy production and use. We still expect by 2035 that we will be using around 2/3 of our current level of liquid fossil fuels, around about 25% of our current use of coal and gas. And even by 2050, in our path, you'll see us, although we are at net zero for long-lived gases, still using 1/3 of the petajoules of liquid fossil fuels that we use today. The transformation of the New Zealand economy, if we get on with it now, can be done over 30 years and achieve our statutory targets and, in our view, meet our international obligations with a transformation that is inclusive by being well forecast, well planned, and maintaining momentum. What will make our transformation hard, what will make it unfair and unjust, is the obfuscation of the need for the transformation to get underway now, and the potential for flip-flopping around policies for short-term economic gain. That will create an investment environment in which the longer-term capital commitments that must be made may be deferred. And the consequence will be a more abrupt, disruptive, and more costly transformation, but later. So the Commission's work was to see whether we could find technically feasible, economically affordable, and socially acceptable pathways to meet our statutory targets. And the answer is yes. But prices and markets alone cannot do the work. Markets do not deal well with low probability catastrophic events. Markets do not care about the distribution of benefits and costs, which we know society does care about. And markets are myopic. They discount the future heavily, giving future generations no say and no vote in the use of resources today that are not available for their use in future generations. For that reason, the Commission sees a strong part for markets to play in the context of social, equitable regulation. The electricity industry has a huge part to play in making the commitments of capital and talent that will be required to put and keep New Zealand on a path to decarbonise the production of electricity while rapidly increasing the use of electricity, particularly in transportation, medium and low temperature heat, and heating the spaces we live and work in. It is a golden age for electricity, but it is a darkening age for fossil fuels. The transformation needs to accelerate, and New Zealand is behind the curve. I do look forward to your questions. Kia ora.
Thanks, Rod. Some very powerful words there, and I'm sure we'll have some really good questions. And really fantastic on open access code. If everyone could go to the website and check it out. I know there's a lot of PhD students here who could make a lot of use.
Code is not there yet, though. The code is not yet on the website. The data, the assumptions, and modelling workshops have been held, and it is our intention to release the source code, but it is not there yet.
Well, we're looking forward. Okay, so we've got a microphone, so whoever's here in person, if you put your hand up to ask a question to any of our panelists or to all of them, we will come to you with that. And anyone online, don't worry, we haven't forgotten about you. If you want us to say your question for you, just type it into the chat and we'll pick at random. Or if you want to speak, we will unmute your microphone. Just say, pick me, or put something in the chat and our IT wizards would come over to your help. So opening the floor to questions. Okay, I see. I'll read out a question from Glenn, unless Glenn wants to read it out himself. I'll give you 3 seconds. Okay, so I'll read it out then. Oh, Harsh is going to unmute you, but if you don't want to talk, I can talk for you. We'll give you one more opportunity. Sorry, Glenn. Okay, so Glenn has a question regarding disruption events to our energy system. An example would be an alpine fault earthquake disrupting the hydro storage capacity in the South Island. Has the Climate Change Commission or other organisations such as Transpower modelled such disruption events? Such loss of hydro storage could be on the scale of multiple terawatt hours.
So let me take a little bit. I have absolutely no doubt that Transpower have indeed given consideration to that. And indeed, I've seen some work in my capacity of Vice Chancellor at the University of Canterbury on the impact on the South Island grid of a rupture along the main divide. So yes, there is work being done and analysis being undertaken. Of course, at the moment, because we have not plugged the Tiwai power into the grid, there would be less disruption than there will be in a world where we have made the Tiwai power available to all New Zealand. And there would be even more risk if we doubled down on building Onslow as well. So I know that part of the work MB will be doing and looking at New Zealand's dry year problem or the New Zealand battery project will consider the risks of distributed rather than concentrated energy storage and generation.
Thank you. And Amelia, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Rod says, you know, it is about resilience across the entire network. A lot of the work that's been done in, you know, any energy systems thinking in New Zealand does look at that energy trilemma of affordability, you know, security of supply, and quantity, I guess. And so that security of supply is really, really important. So I think in terms of how we integrate the energy system and the electricity system, you know, that's how we think about all those things working together. Definitely looking at the availability given, you know, New Zealand's situation on a fault line is top of mind.
Thanks, Amelia. And Andre, any thoughts to share?
I think just the most important thing is a decentralized mindset is required to really manage those risks. You know, I think we cannot just expect resilience to come from a centralized perspective anymore. You have to look at distributed demand side options as well. So, yeah, that's the only thought yet.
Thanks, Andre. Anybody else on the floor would like to ask a question? Oh, we got one here. We've got Norman. He's going to come up to the camera to talk to you.
Thanks, Kate. This is, I'll identify myself. So this is Nirmal Nair from University of Auckland. So thanks for the wonderful presentation. So my question is around some of the comments which you made, Amelia, around innovation, right? So what role innovation plays, and could we have New Zealand has usually been fast followers or, you know, good citizens of the world. And you identified certain opportunities about, you know, things which we have not done in the past, like offshore wind generation and things like that, right? So which other parts of the world, which I think Kate is coming from Ireland, and I think we had Mark Melly, who couldn't make it because of a personal bicycle accident. Yeah. What is it? Yeah. Okay. So my question is more around what role innovation does play. Do we have New Zealand DIY mentality which can scale up, right? So scale up in the bigger sense of the world. So because we are a fortunate position right now to have this discussion here, even though the rest of the world is talking about, you know, how to manage the COVID and things like that. We're talking about long-term problems. So we are at a university setting. So I'm just curious to your thought about what role innovation can play. And then I would also like to pitch that to Andre here. You know, there's going to be a lot of disruption and things like that while the innovation process is going on. How is he going to manage back to network, because we live in Auckland, we don't want a blackout, do we, Kate? No, yeah, okay. Yeah, and to Rod, in the broader sense of how are we going to finance, you know, these new possibilities, which you put a lot of hope on electricity as a silver bullet for now, at least for the first 5 or 10 years. But should we take the challenge or should we not take the challenge? What are the challenges? And can we be left behind to try something innovative? So it's all in the space of innovation spiral. Can we do it, and are we small enough and well connected and so on and so forth as a team of 5 million? So it's a big question, but yeah, and I just thought I'll try to break the ice here. Okay.
Sure, thank you for your question. So yeah, so I think as I said in my presentation, innovation has many different aspects. There's definitely the search for those amazing commercial opportunities, you know, the bladeless wind turbines made of wood, the incredible pumps that will enable us to use seawater to input into hydrogen production. That type of innovation and commercialization is incredibly important, and Araaki is definitely working with organisations, to get some of that to market. And I think we do have a great DIY mentality and a very innovative network of amazing people, working in universities and CRIs around New Zealand, as well as private businesses who are doing amazing things. But then we absolutely, as a small country, need to take on innovation from other places and adapt it to our settings. And that is definitely a form of innovation. And so, as we said, where we don't have offshore wind in New Zealand, there's generally been the thought that we don't need to have offshore wind because we have an amazing onshore wind resource. But if you're looking at more integrated energy systems and how you want to, for example, export energy from New Zealand, maybe we do need offshore wind to create hydrogen production at scale, which then can be exported. There's a lot of opportunities. We need to think about how some of these other energy solutions like bioenergy, the biogas, for example, can be used. And so I'm really, really excited about the possibilities to not just create innovation and commercial opportunities in New Zealand, but also to think about how some of our unique circumstances in New Zealand can be used to enhance innovations that we bring in from overseas. Thank you.
Thanks, Amelia. And I think this is a question for everyone. So I know Rod is writing some things down. So I think he's got some thoughts to share.
So let me jump in on a few things. The first of all, in developing our path, particularly the first two budget periods to 2025 and 2030, it won't surprise you to know that the Commission had a discussion about how should we think about technology and the part it will play in the near term. And rough orders of magnitude, we say, look, if a technology isn't already available and commercially able to be taken up, it isn't going to make much difference in the first budget period, which I remind you is till 2025. So effectively, that's why you see pretty modest reductions in New Zealand's gross and net emissions in the first budget period. And given that our emissions continued to rise in the most latest data presented, which was 2019, by another 2%, we haven't even been able to bend the curve yet. So we've got quite a lot of work to do as a country other than COVID lockdowns to actually reduce and change the underlying energy infrastructure of this country. But into the period 2025-2030, again, we took a view that only a technology which was currently available that was on a declining cost curve and likely to have a take-up rate could be factored into emissions budgets by the end of this decade. And then in the 2035 period, there's some modest nod to the part that biofuels and biomass might be playing in transport, some nod to the possibility that hydrogen in certain contexts may actually be more cost effective than battery electric, and some willingness to accept that there may be other more efficient ways of generating from renewable sources. But basically, it's not a pray for technology emissions budget pathway to 2035. When it comes to New Zealand, there are two particular areas where relatively New Zealand will be advantaged proportionate to its economy and society if the world does these two things faster. One is the development of sustainable aviation fuel so that we can remain connected physically to the world by air travel without damaging the environment. And the other is the development of biogenic methane inhibitors that will allow us to continue to practice our particular style of ruminant pastoral agriculture without doing damage to the environment through the emission of biogenic methane. So those are two particular technologies that we have not banked on getting, but we know will relatively advantage New Zealand. Otherwise, our assumption has been that New Zealanders are quick to adapt foreign technology and adopt it quite rapidly when the economics of it suit them. So all of that bodes well if the world does create new technologies that are adapted for New Zealand circumstances and become widely adopted. One of the challenges around EVs is that while the total cost of lifetime ownership is at a par with newly imported secondhand cars, the capital cost up front creates a jump or a hurdle which many New Zealanders find difficult to overcome. So if I go back to the question of financing, how to finance these new possibilities? Well, there's two levels of financing. One is the world is awash with capital to finance the application of known and proven technologies to reduce carbon emissions. So whether it's raising capital to build out a new geothermal field or a new wind farm or new solar arrays, whether it's to raise new capital to build out an EV manufacturing plant, I am not hearing anywhere in the world that that is subject to a capital constraint. There has always been a bit of a capital constraint on innovation, particularly where innovators overstate the probability of success and likely impact of their innovation. They need to do that overstating, otherwise they would never get out of bed in the morning. But that optimism, which is required, is also more challenging to finance. So I don't see that changing dramatically. A couple of comments on offshore wind. One of the challenges for New Zealand is that our offshore gets deep pretty quickly. So not only do we have onshore available land that the UK didn't have, but in addition, apart from Taranaki, we don't have easily accessible offshore that would be socially acceptable. I mean, you could think about sticking windmills in the Kaipara Harbour, but I suspect that's not necessary or desirable. There is no doubt that using wind and solar to create hydrogen, particularly if you have excess supplies of one or both, and therefore you would spill the solar or wind for no value, does represent an opportunity in some places. Whether it represents a comparative opportunity in New Zealand is a moot point. Our friends to the west have free land, a long east-west axis. They are further north than we are, and they do infrastructure projects at a scale we can barely imagine. I suspect it will be hard to compete with solar hydrogen from Australia. I expect that we would be a niche player in that global market and not a low-cost provider. And when it comes to the question of what we might do with biomass and biofuels, it is very early days, but in a bioeconomy, it may well be that there are opportunities for New Zealand to extract energy values from biomass as a waste stream from the development of our sequestration in forests. That's probably enough from me, but very interesting topic.
Yeah, and Kate, you know, if I can add, with a slightly different focus, maybe more on networks, since Rod and Amelia covered the wider chain for us there, I think we're extremely well placed from an innovation perspective, although there's still a lot to do. But I think the most important message that I've heard Rod also confirmed is that this is not just a technology challenge. We're talking about how society, how customers, how policymakers, how our people respond to this. You know, this is much, much, much wider than just having a new technology or a new system. I think as long as we keep the objective in mind from a networks perspective, that is, of affordable and equitable outcomes for customers, that's the starting point that we have to start to think of innovation. Now, if you think of customers, I'll just run through a few key areas for me. You know, just demonstrating with those few slides at a high level the benefit that integrating the electricity network and the customer network, how the mutual benefits there, how we can have the combined energy, you know, electricity distribution system be much more smaller than if you just try and adopt a centralized approach. I think another critical point for us is visibility into the networks. We've got amazing data analytical capability and advanced tools, but we need the data. Now, New Zealand is one of the only places in the world that has got smart meters to the extent that we have it. And I mean, there are positive signs afoot that we will get access to that smart meter data now, but it's been a challenge for the past decade to get that data, to use it for network purposes. But that is changing, and I'm very encouraged by that. I think flexibility is the other thing that's very important. If you put aside a centralized one-way power flow network, like what we used, and you think of distributed, resilient, renewable generation all over the place, we've got solutions like that in place. All the EDBs and Vector specifically have trialed grid batteries, behind the meter batteries, microgrids. All this new technology give us an option, and really it's there. It's just how we make it work. How does the regulatory frameworks support that so that we can deploy those solutions to achieve those customer outcomes that I referred to? I think the other thing that's very, very important is modernization of our power grid. The digital capability and the cost of the digital tools and of communication and of sensors have come down so significantly that we're at the point now where we see that convergence of traditional network solutions and digital solutions. One example of a digital platform that 4 years ago when we deployed it was sort of world leading. Now every company nearly has got one, as our distributed, Vector's distributed energy resource management system. So all those graphs that I showed you, talking to all those, in this case, smart EV chargers out there, is enabled through a system that optimizes it, uses artificial intelligence, uses dynamic sort of data points to optimize the flow of power, reduce the coincidental demand. And I think just the last point, and I'm rushing this a bit because there's so much to say on this topic, but it's the value of integration. Now, we can talk about integration all we want, but if we don't get the policy support, for instance, to say, hey, listen, if you deploy a charger in your house, make it a smart IP addressable charger, and talk to your retailer about what plan they have, talk to your alliance company about how that can be integrated with the network in a way that gives you total customer satisfaction. I mean, we've been doing this for years with hot water load control, where, 99% of the people on hot water load control do not know that there is a system out there that control their hot water cylinders to keep the peak demand low. So really, we said we've got all these tools. We're developing them. We can't keep up with the rate of development. We just need collectively to create a framework, and each of us need to accept their accountability in this, because it doesn't come, what Rod is talking about doesn't come free. There's big trade-offs being made here, but everybody just has to accept the accountability and responsibility and throw their powers together and sort of make it easy for every part of the chain to make it work. But it's there, the innovation, the work being done by universities. It is just amazing what's happening. We just need to bring it all together.
Yeah, I agree, Andre. I think, Vector's doing a lot in terms of EV trials, and we're getting this data with, the writings on the wall. How can policy keep up to ensure that consumers are making the right choices? Because, we can educate a lot, but what really needs to happen? Interested to hear your views on that, Amelia and Rod.
I absolutely 1,000% agree with Rod's point that you can't just have markets, and you can't just have regulation. Regulation and markets have to work together to make good choices. It's there will always be parts of the system that the market won't be able to reach in terms of being able to change decision making. For example, you look at the rate of the carbon price on fuel, just putting the petrol into your car. The carbon price has to be so high to change people's decision making around vehicle choice. It doesn't really work. There has to be other incentives to get the scale of light electric vehicles into the market that we need. So, the Productivity Commission recommended fee baits. there are scrappage schemes in other parts of the world. They're absolutely critical as working hand in hand with the market. I definitely think that a market is a really, really great way to incentivize change in conjunction with regulation. It will encourage innovation if you have high prices, especially early, as I mentioned. It does enable really good price discovery. It does enable better distribution of change in the most efficient way. But again, it has to be supported by regulation, because oftentimes markets are inherently regressive. We need regulation that makes that supports progressive choices across the economy. For example, again, getting back to vehicles, a lot of New Zealand's older vehicles are owned by people on lower incomes, and expecting them to change, as Rod said, the upfront cost of an EV is really, really high. You can talk about total cost of ownership all you want, but if you can't cobble together the money to get a light EV, you're never going to change. I mean, there are communities out there in New Zealand who cannot afford a new fridge, who can't afford some of those things that a lot of other people in New Zealand take for granted. And so, we have to have a lot of options there, and regulation around active transport and better availability of choices. Markets are not very good at providing a range of choices necessarily across the community according to need. So yeah, I strongly support the view that markets and regulation go hand in hand to creating the innovation and the speed of change that we need to see in a way that reflects what is coined a just transition. It can't be too fast for people to adapt, but it must be fast enough that we give those choices to future generations.
Well said.
I think you spoke for Rod there too, eh? We've got some more questions in the chat. I'll pick one directed at Andrea, because there's quite a lot of EV and energy, distributed energy resources there. So one from Lakshita: can distributed energy resources enhance the resilience of the system? Also, what are the factors that influence the resilience cost?
Look, I think it's a very good question, and the answer to the first one is definitely our vehicle to grid trial has proven that it can. To Charlie's point earlier on his slides, he made the point it is still relatively new and quite immature, but you can just imagine having a million mobile generators driving around in Auckland in case of a central North Island incident and you lose the transmission network into Auckland. Those can get to a local plug-in point. You can keep the lights on. So it certainly, we've shown with the PHAR trial that vehicle to home, as long as your vehicle is charged at the time that the incident happened, is a very, very, very good way for personal resilience. And it's also a nice way to go camping, if you think about it. So the cost is a very wide question, and I'm not quite sure exactly, Lakshita, what your answer, what you're looking for there. Can you maybe pin it down for me a bit more?
She's actually here, so we'll take it to the microphone.
Nice.
Yeah. Hi, Andrea. Hi, everyone. It was really great presentation from all of you, and I heard very interesting things. So for the resilience cost, I am just interested to know, like, when we have a storm or weather, like extreme weather events, and we have an outage, so how it's impacting the investment or the loss, like in terms of money. So how are we calculating that resilience cost? Like, what kind of solutions can we have, and how can we calculate the cost for that, like to make a profit or at least to keep the lights on? Because if we have a storm or if there is an outage, I think even if we have solar up roof, like on our roof, it will go as well, because everything will be like shut. So how can we like calculate those things? Like what kind of models are there? I'm just interested to know.
Look, it's a very good question, and probably going to give you an answer that you don't really want to hear. But I think just on the solar matter, if you've got a battery as well, then that's perfectly okay, because then the battery can drive the house. So yes, for safety reasons, solar panels aren't, in those conditions. But with the right installation, combining with the battery, you can have a very resilient installation at your house. The cost is a difficult one, because you can go to our own electricity authority's website, and there's a formulas there to calculate the cost of load not being available. But what we've seen and what I've experienced in my life, and specifically at Vector, and those living in Auckland will know of that horrendous storm we had in 2018, when thousands of trees were blown over and took the overhead lines down. When you're in a storm event like that, it's about what matters to customers. They don't really want to hear about the cost of resilience or the cost of investment. They just want to know, how quickly can you bring my power back? Are you doing everything in your power? Can you communicate with me effectively? And I've learned that that's a much, much better measure, is to focus on, Charlie made the point about resilience. Resilience has got a number of aspects to it. The one is, what is your investment leading into to sort of make the network more robust against incidents like the one you're referring to? We know it's impossible from an affordability perspective to make the network 100% proof against extreme events. We know that's not feasible. Some people have argued that undergrounding the Auckland network, would be a nice way to make the Auckland network more robust against wind. Now, if you put aside the estimated $4 billion bill to do that, you look at the April storm, a number of those trees uprooted the cables because the roots have grown into the cables. So if you look at the New York experience, flooding of underground circuits mean that those networks took much, much longer to repair than overhead lines. So I think, if you look at that aspect, it's impossible to build a total resilient network. Then you look at how quickly you can recover post an event, and that's where our focus is and has been over the past few years, is how can you recover? How can you keep your customers informed? How can you maintain the well-being of customers? We learned a lot about the impact of vulnerable, of those sort of events on vulnerable customers. And that comes back to why it's so important to have access to the data, because the smart meter can actually tell you when a customer's without power. Although you've restored the network, there may still be a tree on their own private line, and you wouldn't know about that unless you've got access to the smart meter data. And then I think a third component of the cost is your example of solar panel, which I've added the battery to. What are customers prepared to invest to, from a shared resilience perspective, make themselves immune against that bit that no network operator can, in an affordable manner, assure. So what do you do on your side to be more resilient? If you've got an EV charger that's charged and it's got vehicle to grid capability or vehicle to home capability, you can power your house, for instance. So I think some of those things will come into the equation as well.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for answering that.
Thank you. I know it's 25 past, but we've got one more question we can fit in from the room because my closing comments are quite quick. Can we just bring the microphone up, please? Just while we get the microphone there, Georgina Price, no questions from me. Just wanted to say this is a fantastic conversation. So thank you, panelists. You're doing a great job.
I can see that there's a question from Glenn just quickly about embodied emissions in the chat. I'd just like to, if you didn't know, so the Productivity Commission recommended that they call it consumption-based greenhouse gas accounting was carried out in New Zealand. So there is a project that Statistics New Zealand is doing consumption-based greenhouse gas accounting. You can find out all about it on the Stats NZ website.
Oh, thank you.
I just have one quick question. It's more energy hardship related. So it's obviously going to be really challenging for the network companies, and that's really clear. I saw a slide yesterday that electricity bills are, I think 27% is towards the distribution. Should we be expecting that cost to really, you know, expand with all these new technologies that we need to integrate?
Look, I'll make a pitch. I think we're going to get a fundamentally different pricing model by pick a date, 2030, 2040, because at the moment, the assumption is that everything is connected to the grid and the power is moving one way from the central generator to the multi-million point users. If more and more people in business and in industry and residential users are distributed generators, then they're looking at the grid not as the primary, but essentially as the backup or the takeout for their excess generation, or the supply when they are unable to generate for their own use. That will lead to a fundamentally different view about the risks and rewards of the ownership of the lines that are the grid and that connect the million points of generation. So I don't know what that reconfigured cost looks like, but you can't assume that what we pay at the moment for what we get is going to reflect what it will cost to get what we need in the future.
Yeah, and Rod, I think I'd like to add to that very good point that you've made there. A sure way to increase energy poverty and energy hardship is to keep on building these networks the way we needed to build them in the past. And I say needed because they really served us well. But if we ignore the power of advanced data analytics, if we ignore the power of data, if we ignore the power of flexible solutions like decentralized distributed generation, like batteries, like other forms of storage, if we ignore the digital systems, and if we don't have the incentives in place with our regulators, if we don't have the standards in place to deploy these things effectively, and if we ignore the pivotal and incremental, not the pivotal, the extremely important aspect of a framework that allows customer devices to be integrated with the network to combinedly offer a more affordable value proposition, then energy poverty will increase and inequality will increase, because people, we already know from our analysis that some of the poorest suburbs in Auckland have got some of the highest energy cost per square meter in their house, because they simply do not have the money to deploy renewable options to reduce the energy costs. And we have to, based on the current approach, if you put aside what Rod said, we spread the cost over everybody. So if one suburb needs huge reinforcement because everybody has got EVs clustered on the same feeder, if we're not careful, those people already struggling will pay more. So it is a risk. You're very right. It's a huge risk, but I fundamentally believe, together with what Rod said, we've got an answer for it. We just need things to fall in place and everybody to agree that that's the way forward.
I'll just make one final comment. I think too about how, we've got to think about New Zealand as a very long, stringy country. And there are clusters of, very dense urban populations. And then there are people who live very, very far, away. And how we manage our grid is definitely something that, obviously Transpower thinks a lot about. And in terms of making sure that we maintain the minimal levels of standards and viability will require investment. And as Andrea said really eloquently, how we make sure that investment is distributed in a way that is fair, I think will be incredibly important.
Yeah, Kate, if people would be with me for 30 seconds to add to what Amelia said, and somebody reminded me of that today, what we saw during COVID with people working from home, and we've seen it in the past as well with people moving out of suburbs in Auckland, the old traditional close to the CBD suburbs, and settling down in some of the more rural areas. And immediately that rural area, the expectations about power and their power needs and energy needs remain the same as it was when they lived in the suburbs very close to the CBD. So we see immediately just, and I'm sure this will be in all jurisdictions, where people are going out from the central city into the edge of the network, as we call it, the needs all of a sudden change. And you can't get away with, oh, it's an urban or a rural network anymore. And COVID just escalated that immensely. I mean, Kate deals with our outage process, and she knows what a difficult task it is, because everybody, where previously a midday power outage to repair an insulator or whatever was totally acceptable, all of a sudden it became totally unacceptable. And we just see that increasing. So everything is being turned on its head, and that's why it's so important to start with what the customer needs are and forget what type of network it is or what type of categorization or segmentation you may have used in the past, because none of those are applicable going forward.
Thanks, Andre. And yes, it was a difficult time for me during COVID, managing outages that affect people learning and working from home.